Department for History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. I would like to thank the organizers of the Alumni Festival for this invitation to present some of my research to you. It's a great opportunity to say something about a project that I've been developing over the last few years. In essence, this project consists in bringing field work to the history of science. The history of science is usually a discipline dedicated to study in dusty archives, and I'm trying to integrate fieldwork with this. And the basic idea is to retrack a historical journey, a historical scientific journey, Carl Linnaeus's Lapland journey in 1732, and work while traveling with local experts on a new online translation of the travel journal Linnaeus produced. So the idea is not to restage this journey in historical costumes, but a little bit like Linnaeus himself, engaging with local people, using his journal as a platform and catalyst for engagement with wider issues that are also of contemporary relevance and that range from sustainability and well-being to indigeneity and sovereignty. I hope to be talking for about 45 minutes and leave some 15 minutes for a Q&A. And I will start my slides now. That needs a little bit of clicking. Can you see my slides? I hope so, yes. Okay. I guess I get feedback if not. Okay, so first, let me provide you with some basic context about Linnaeus and his Lapland journey. He traveled, as I already mentioned, in the summer of 1732, so almost 300 years ago. He was, when he traveled, a 25-year medical student from Uppsala. He received funding from the Royal Society of Science in Uppsala. That was an academy that is not to be mixed up with the Stockholm Academy of Sciences, which Linnaeus later should co-found in 1739. So the Royal Society of Science in Uppsala funded this trip. And it was also supported by a number of influential patrons, industrialists, politicians, and so on. Linnaeus had studied medicine at the universities of Lund and Uppsala, but he came from a rather poor background, from a very poor province in Sweden, Småland. His father was a country parson, so he could afford very few lectures. Linnaeus was basically self-taught. He managed to teach himself basically by striking on good relations with professors. He sought support from professors who would lodge him in their house and also grant him access to their libraries. And Lapland, the Lapland journey offered him really a great opportunity to climb up the career ladder even a little bit further. It is quite clear that he saw this as a great opportunity for becoming famous among learned circles. Now, Linnaeus's Lapland journey has raised the attention of scholars under two main perspectives. The first is the perspectives from which Linnaeus appears as an explorer of an area that was not yet known to European science. He was entering an empty, unknown space, a terra nullius, a land that belongs to no one, to bring back knowledge from this remote region. And under this perspective, Linnaeus has mainly been celebrated as a pioneer of ethnographic, methods of ethnographic and ecological. So it's important to realize that Linnaeus promoted this perspective on his journey already during his lifetime. He was a great self-promoter. What you see on this slide is a famous image of him in a Sami costume. He's posing as a Sami. It was an image that was produced while he stayed in Holland to obtain his doctoral degree, but then also to work as a curator for a big botanical collection. And he sold himself as the son of Boreas when he was there. He used his Lapland journey really as an asset to make himself known to colleagues and influential people. And in this context, he always emphasized that Lapland was a wilderness, a place nobody really knew, and that he was the first to bring knowledge back from that. The second perspective under which Linnaeus's journey has been viewed is that of a journey important in the context of early colonialism. The Swedish state was actively colonizing the north, its northern regions. There was a language of the settler societies. People, the crown actively funded people to settle in remote regions, moving up the rivers of Lapland. And there was a lot of valuable goods to get from Lapland. Mining was important, silver mining, furs, of course, but also very importantly, fish. And Linnaeus can also be seen as participating in this development. He justified, when he sought the funds from the Royal Society of Science in Uppsala, he justified his journey in this way that he would provide knowledge about the natural riches of Lapland. And after his return, he also authored advice and gave advice on how to colonize Lapland further. So what you see on this slide is a short text Linnaeus produced, a memorial on the cultivation of Lapland, or Lappmarken, as it's called in Swedish also. And in this manuscript, which was directed at the Royal Society for Sciences, he proposed to use a certain grass, lime grass, instead of cereal, because that was much hardier, and it was also known as a famine food, food that people took recourse to in times of famine. That would, of course, mean the cultivation of Lapland with cereals and so on, would, of course, in the end mean the destruction of life, ways of life that a lot of the people in the north followed, especially the Sami and reindeer herders. Now, in our project, we want to develop a different perspective. That not to say that the two that I've just described are wrong, but to sort of find a middle way. The basic idea is to take the journal. Here is an image of the travel journal that Linnaeus produced during his trip. To take this journal and produce an online edition, a new translation and edition of this journal, but to do so while retracking Linnaeus's trip, while traveling ourselves. So I'm doing this with Elena Isaev, a colleague from University of Exeter. And the idea is to complete the editing and translating process in discussion with local experts. We have received funding from the British Academy and the Leverhulme Foundation to pilot the methodology, to try it out. And that's a little bit what I want to talk to you about. But first, a little bit about the journey itself. So what we're trying to achieve is a view that shows how Linnaeus interacted with the landscapes, the people, the nature he encountered during his journey. And we're following the lead of a colleague, a former colleague of mine here in Cambridge, Jim Secord, who has spoken about knowledge in translation, who has spoken about science as really only coming about through the circulation of knowledge. And we want to bring into view all the exchanges that Linnaeus had with local people that shaped his views of Lapland. And that brings into sight things like translation itself, of course, as a big issue, but also the infrastructures Linnaeus had to use, the people who guided him, and the people he encountered during his journey. So let me say a few things about the journey itself. So here is a map that Linnaeus himself drew of his of the way he took through Swedish Lapland. I hope you can see this. You have the outlines of the Baltic Sea here, and Sweden, Finland, Norway with its mountains up here. And basically Linnaeus traveled along the coast and then made little excursions into the land along rivers wherever he could. Two are prominent: this excursion into Luxele, as it's called, and this excursion, which took him all the way into the Laplandic highlands, the fells, and even to the other side, to the Norwegian coast. This was much more south, as Linnaeus draws it here. He wants to give a good impression to his funders, but that's basically the pattern he follows. He also travels up a little bit to Torne River, that is up here, and then returned through this Finnish-speaking areas of the Swedish kingdom, down south, the Finnish Baltic coast, and then traveled over to Uppsala again across the Baltic. So this highlights that he was dependent on infrastructure, because highways went along the coast, and the way inland was by rivers only. You traveled by boat basically inland, or once the rivers had too many rapids and so on, you had to carry on by foot, whereas on the highways you could take a horse. Now, traveling back then needed documentation, as it does today, but the documentation you had to have with you was not a passport or an identity card, but basically letters of recommendation. Linnaeus was equipped with letters of recommendation by the Royal Society for Sciences, but also by provincial governors. And these letters basically emphasized that he was on a patriotic mission and that people should host him, help him, because they would thus promote the wealth of the nation. So Linnaeus could count on hospitality during his trip, and he very often stayed with parsons, especially in the more remote regions that he came to, at the very frontier of Swedish settler society. Now, what is curious is that Linnaeus kept an exact account of his hosts and wrote little mini reviews of these hosts. So you can see here highlighted a little review of Pastor Ole Gran in Luxele, A quiet, handsome man suffered inconvenience from me, both on the journey up and down the river, promoted my journey with great care, delighted me well, and gave me a lap boat in miniature, which cost 2 carolines. Linnaeus also has bad things to say about some of his hosts. So, for example, Propst Zacharias Plantin in Umeå accepted me dishonorably, an ambitious man, very inconsiderate, nor does his erudition approach his name and achievement by more than 3%. So this is a long list. It carries on for another 2 pages and shows how much Linnaeus was dependent on people, but people sort of his own linguistic community and to quite some extent of his own class. Now, this was very different once he entered Sami territory. The Sami paid taxes back then and also enjoyed protection of certain rights they had to land and especially to water, so fishing rights. But they enjoyed a lot of autonomy. They were basically still self-governed. So that's why Lappmarken, this Swedish geographic expression, endures till today. It's the inland, it's the land of the Sami, if you translate it literally. And to enter these areas, Linnaeus needed a different kind of document, not a letter of recommendation, but really something like an order to the Sami to let him pass freely, but not only that, but also to provide him with guides and translators that help him along the way. So Linnaeus couldn't have made that journey without this kind of support. The language that is used here of obligingness is very interesting because it shows that to some extent the support was given voluntarily. And Linnaeus was warned that the Sami are quick with a gun. He reports on that, and he was actually once shot at, though he wasn't damaged by that. It's a little bit a murky story, but it wasn't, it could be dangerous to enter these areas. So getting that kind of support was very important, and for that he needed these official writings from governors. Now, this, as you can see, describes very different situations in which Linnaeus finds himself. On the one hand, hosted by people of his own class, of his own culture. On the other hand, entering a territory with people that speak a different language, that have a different culture, a totally different livelihood, reindeer herders. We've published an article recently in which we explore how these different situations actually shaped the knowledge that Linnaeus collected. It is quite striking when one looks at the portion of the journal that were written up in Swedish territories, in settler territories, that he writes in a kind of timeless present about the Sami. The Sami are described from a kind of objective perspective in a very compartmentalized way. Linnaeus goes through one aspect of Sami culture after the other, how they marry, how they host foreigners, how they treat their reindeer, what kind of equipment they use, the architecture of their housings. But it's sort of one by one and compartmentalized and written in what is called the ethnographic present, as if this culture was the same forever and totally static. Now, if one reads very carefully, one realizes that this is information Linnaeus gets at the table, as we call it, while staying with his hosts the parsons, who of course interact with the Sami and have already built up some kind of body of knowledge about the Sami that is to some extent codified. In the mountains, when he actually has to stay with the Sami and is at their mercy, wouldn't survive without them, without their guidance and without their help, the tone of the journal changes, and you get a first-person account that talks about the interactions, the encounters he has with Sami, which are sometimes friendly, sometimes a little bit hostile. Often the guides, after several days, just walk off and are not ready anymore to serve Linnaeus. So it's an interactive situation he finds himself in, and the knowledge he here produces is therefore also of a different kind. It is a knowledge that is much more attentive to processes, to interactions among different kinds of organisms and the Sami, and that shows a kind of sensibility for processes and interactions in nature. So I'm going to explain that with an example in a little bit more detail, but I now want to switch to the methodology we were using in finding out some of these things. So as I said, the project is about retracking Linnaeus's journey. So, and that's what we've been able to do with funding from the Leverhulme and the British Academy for little bits of his journey. And one of these little journeys we ourselves had in the footsteps of Linnaeus also took us to the highlands, the fells of Lapland, of Swedish Lapland, an area nowadays known as Padjelanta. It's a national park, it's a UNESCO heritage site, and our trip started off in Kvikkjokk. That was sort of the outpost of settler society at the time of Linnaeus. And it remains to this day sort of the entry point to get into the fells there. Linnaeus stayed in Kvikkjokk with a local priest, with a local parson for 3 days, both on his way up and on his way down. What you see on this map is, first of all, the route we took up to Staloluokta, which was along an official trail, so a trail marked out by people with huts at regular interval where one could stay overnight. And the green trail is the green line indicates the trail that Linnaeus went actually, and that is the trail we also took back. So how did we learn about Linnaeus's trail, where he actually went? Well, we learned about it simply by asking people while moving up to Staloluokta. So these are some images from moving up there. You have lots of posters along the way that explain you details of the landscape. It's a very well-marked trail. As I mentioned, with these huts. And to begin with, in our way up, it took us 5 days to walk to Staloluokta, that is up there at this lake. That's where Linnaeus stayed with the Sami for a good week, one can say. And we wanted to go there too. And to begin with, the first half of this 5-day trips, these huts were run by Swedish people. And after that, they were managed by Sami. The Sami manage the national park or are involved in the management of the national park. They do reindeer herding there. And we were actually on our way to Staloluokta to meet one of these people, a woman who also runs the local kiosk, has reindeer there during the summer, stays there in the summer, but also does a PhD on long distance education. The use of basically online teaching to teach Sami to young children. So a very interesting woman, and we were looking forward to see her. So to begin with, Swedish hosts, and then a switch to Sami hosts. And one could immediately feel a difference because the Sami hosts knew each other and also, of course, knew the region very intimately. So, and by systematically asking each and everybody person we thus met, whether they knew Linnaeus and whether they knew where he went, we figured out his original route. The first person to tell us something about this was someone called Björn. He runs a ferry service that takes you over a lake at Kvikkjokk to the beginning of the trail that we walked. Ferrymen play a crucial role also in Linnaeus's own journey accounts. He always mentions ferrymen. And Björn was very interesting because he turned out to be a descendant of the parson that had hosted Linnaeus in 1732, and he knew all about Linnaeus's trip and knew exactly where the house of his forefathers had stood on a small island in that lake. So that's where Linnaeus must have stayed overnight, and could tell us a lot of details about his family and Linnaeus. It also turned out that Björn, the ferryman, was a real Newton fan, a fan of Isaac Newton, and very curious about what one could learn about Newton in Cambridge. He had never been to Cambridge, but planned to go one day. He had read all sorts of books, including scholarly books about Newton. So a very interesting personality. And he also gave us the first indications where Linnaeus had gone. And these were confirmed then by other people we had a chance with, especially Katarina, the woman we were visiting in Stalolurta. And it turns out that the trail that Linnaeus had taken was still in existence. Now it's not an officially marked trail. It is used by the locals as a kind of shortcut to get back into the valley, to get down to the mountains or up into the mountains. Yeah, that's the trail we then took back from the mountains. And as you can see from these images, it was much wilder. The trail was most of the time not to be seen. It is known to locals as the Parsons Trail, because in the 17th century, the Swedish mined for silver in these mountains, and a little settlement was set up, and a mine, of course. And twice, 3 times a year, a parson would make his way to this mine and back again along this route. The route was also used to transport the silver ore down into the valley. So in the 17th century, it was a very well-used trail. And apparently, when Linnaeus visited, the mine had already closed by then. It was still in use by locals to go up and down the mountains, often with their reindeer. So it's still visible. It is marked by stones, by risen stones, as you can see on these images. So one can find that way. But the landscape is much harsher. You get much higher up. It is really quite a demanding trail, and we sort of reached our limits on it. There was a lot to see that was described by Linnaeus, like this grouse. Linnaeus describes its peculiar behavior, that it doesn't run away. You can approach this animal. You can come very close without it running away. Linnaeus says he could have killed it 100 times. And this is a behavior that these animals show when they want to protect their chicks. So they are basically detracting attention from their chicks. And we saw a grouse that showed exactly the same kind of behavior and looked exactly like Linnaeus described it. So this was quite a moment during our trip. Now, I want to give a final example and then come to an end of my presentation of the kind of knowledge that Linnaeus got out of his trip himself, and in what kind of ways he processed what he learned in Lapland and prepared it for his later publications. The Lapland journal was never published during his lifetime. The first publication of the Lapland journal was in 1811 in an English translation produced or commissioned rather by the president of the Linnaean Society of London, James Edward Smith. But Linnaeus used his journal as a kind of resource to fill a lot of his publications with information about Lapland. And I just want to give you one example where one can sort of see the journey knowledge takes from initial encounters in the field to final publications. So this, the example I want to use for that refers to something that is very well known from Lapland. Everybody who has been there knows about it, namely the huge amount of rather unpleasant, often blood-sucking insects you encounter up there. This includes mosquitoes and horseflies and midges, and they can appear in huge quantities. This was already a well-known phenomenon when Linnaeus traveled. So what I'm showing you here are two pages from a book about Lapland published by one Johannes Schäffer, an Uppsala scholar in the 1670s. He, on these two pages, he describes in great detail the insects in Lapland and how people protect themselves from these insects. And one of the insects he mentions, that's on the right-hand side of this slide at the top, in the third line, if you can see it in that detail. One of these insects he mentions here is a curious one. It is a parasitic fly. It's known as Kaorm, as he puts it here, Schäffer. And these are allegedly small holes in the reindeer skin that come from a wasp. Geting is the Swedish word he uses here, that bites itself into the skin of reindeer during the summer. Now, Linnaeus was actually asked to investigate this fly. He was equipped by the Royal Society for Sciences with a long list of questions. There are about 100 questions that he was supposed to answer during his journey. And the fifth question, I show you the beginning of the lists here on this slide. The fifth question is about reindeer, rangiferos, historia, the history of reindeer, and the holes in their skin, the damage in their skin, varices pellis. Varix is a medical expression. It can mean something like ulcer. So the ulcer in their skins. So Linnaeus was looking for this insect. He was asked to look for this insect and learn as much as possible about it. Now, one of the problems one has when traveling is trying to make observations while traveling is that the observations on one and the same subject are of course not possible at any given time. Your observations will sort of be in one spot on one day, and then the next thing you observe about the same subject will be 3 weeks later at an entirely different place. So you have to find a way of piecing together various observations. And indeed, the observations on the reindeer wobble fly, as it is known, are scattered all over Linnaeus's journal. There are all in all maybe 10 observations on this fly, and they are scattered all around. I'm showing 2 examples here, and what you may note is that these examples show that Linnaeus numbered the paragraphs of his journal. Each paragraph in his journal has a number. Here 141, and here it is 148. Now, what do these numbers mean? They were actually used by Linnaeus to draw up a long index of the contents of his journal. This index has never been edited or published, and it breaks down the contents of the journal into great detail. So one of the pages of this index only deals with reindeer, their economy, their anatomy, the use the Sami make of them, how they are slaughtered, how they reproduce, every aspect. And one of these aspects is the diseases that they suffer from, morbi, as it says here. The first disease they suffer from is rather unfortunate, castration, that they suffer at the hands of their human tenders, of course. But the second is kurpma. You recognize the word probably, and you see Linnaeus adds the numbers 141 and 148 to that. So he systematically references the content of his journal in this way. Kurpma, interestingly, also appears in the list of insects. So the same word is used both for a disease and for an insect. And the word is Sami. So this is a strong indication that Linnaeus as well learns about this from the Sami. And as in many vernacular languages, the entity that causes a disease is identified with a disease in a way. So like one says, fleas, I have fleas. One can say that the reindeer suffer from kurpma and use that word also for the insect. So in the ontology of the Sami, in the worldview of the Sami, the disease and the insect are sort of the same thing. They are just aspects of one and the same process in a way. And but in the index Linnaeus draws up, they fall into 2 categories. They fall into disease on the one hand and an insect species on the other. Now, this is significant if one looks at how Linnaeus then goes on to publish about this insect. There's one trail where you see the insect receiving a Latin name and entering all the taxonomic works of Linnaeus. Linnaeus is known for his work in taxonomy, for the invention of binomial nomenclature, so names like Homo sapiens for humans, and for drawing up a catalogue of life, one can say, in the 18th century. And here are 2 of these works, the Fauna Svecica, a catalogue of Swedish animals, and you have here the entry for for the reindeer wobble fly, species number 1025, and it has a Latin name, Oestrus thorace flavo cingulo nigro. It's a descriptive name, a diagnostic name, but it has a Latin name. But the Sami name is mentioned. It is here under in what is called the list of synonyms. So the Sami name is retained. In Systema Naturae, maybe Linnaeus's most famous taxonomic work, a kind of world catalog of all known plant and animal species. We find Oestrus, the species Oestrus tarandi, so he's using binomial nomenclature here. Again, a number of references, but the Sami name is gone. Yeah. The insect is identified here entirely by receiving a label by Linnaeus. Now, if one looks, on the other hand, at Linnaeus's interest for the disease, one can see a completely different treatment of the reindeer wobble fly. So one of Linnaeus's first publications in the Journal of the Stockholm Academy of Sciences, which, as I mentioned already, he co-founds in 1739, is about the damage that the reindeer suffer from this disease. This was an economically very significant damage because it affected the quality of the leather that could be produced from reindeer, and this leather was very sought after, not the least by the Swedish army. Now, this essay contains a complete life history of the insect and also a description of how the reindeer react to its presence, how they try to flee from this insect, how they try to escape it. It is rather unpleasant, of course, to have kurkma, to have this disease. But astonishingly, Linnaeus also in this essay manages to take in the perspective of the fly itself. He describes how it chases the reindeer to find, as he puts it, a home for its young. It describes the whole life history, we would say nowadays, of this fly in very empathetic terms, in terms that could always make you believe that Linnaeus here is identifying himself as a parasite that sort of gets under the skin of the Sami. It's a very interesting and very poetic piece. What one should say, however, is that here again, the Sami are pushed to the margin. From the journal, it's pretty to the margin. From the journal, it's pretty clear that they provide Linnaeus with a lot of this very detailed ecological knowledge about the interactions between the wobble fly and the reindeer. But in this publication, Linnaeus pretends that it is him who finds all about all of this, and that the Sami are just an audience standing around in astonishment at his abilities in writing down notes and making little drawings of the fly. So he's not quite honest here about how this knowledge came about. Okay, I want to come to an end. This is a section from a letter that Linnaeus writes to an Englishman a few years later, Philip Miller, a gardener, a very prominent gardener, in which he develops a theory about the wobble fly and the reindeer. It's a theory that builds on the idea of a natural balance, namely, and the basic idea is that it is actually not the Sami, but the fly, the wobble fly, that herds the reindeer. It drives them up into the mountains And the reindeer will go as high as they can to escape the fly, just to the limit where they are just about able to find enough food. And the fly will follow them, but it can also only reach a certain height until it's too cold. And the two sort of balance each other out so that the reindeer are not infested too much by the fly, but the fly still finds the home for its young during winter. So a balanced theory of ecological interactions. Now, what is astonishing is that when we presented this once to anthropologists in Rovaniemi, that is in Finland, the University of Lapland is there, they told us this is exactly what the Sami tell you. And indeed, on YouTube, you can find videos in which you see Russian reindeer herders from West Siberia demonstrating to children, demonstrating the fly to children, showing the ovipositor, the press on it, the ovipositor comes out. And then at the very end of the video, you see how the reindeer herder strokes the fly. He obviously considers it not as a pest, but as a helper. And that's also the theory that the Sami themselves have about the wobble fly. Okay, so I think I've overrun a little bit, but I would like to end you here. There's a website for the project, Linnaeus's Laplandic journey. You can easily find it by Googling Linnaeus Lapland, Linnaeus in Lapland. And I thank you very much for your attention and invite you to ask questions if you want. Here's a question. Should I read the questions or can we invite people to speak? I don't know. Rosie? Well, I will just then just
go ahead and read the questions. Yeah, that'd be great.
I will. Okay, good. Okay, so I will read the question. So Daryl Francis asks, I visited the Linnaeus Museum in July this year, where the text relating to the Lapland journey reads, Linnaeus tended to exaggerate the difficulties of the journey and to describe the Sami culture as exotic to colleagues in Europe. In his lectures, the Sami people were often used as examples of a natural and healthy lifestyle in contrast to the artificial lifestyle of urban society. How far would you agree with this? Are you a contributor to their presentations so they will share in your research? Yeah, so I can only wholeheartedly agree with this. Linnaeus did exaggerate the difficulties of the journey. It may have been harrowing conditions in some instances. The most famous is when he gets stuck with his guides in a swamp in north of Lycksele. That's a town in Ume, Lappmark, so northwest of Umeå, one can say. And they were just unlucky to be caught in spring floods and lots of rain, and they were just stuck. And in this situation, it also became clear why Linnaeus usually traveled with two guides. He had always two people, because one of them then goes off to fetch help while the other stays with Linnaeus. Yeah, so that's an indication that yeah, there were hardships and it wasn't completely without risk, this trip. One should say, however, that he certainly did not travel as far or as long as he often claimed. He didn't cover all the distances he claimed. He was paid by the mile. His expenses were paid by the mile. So he had an interest in it, very direct interest in exaggerating. And one should also keep in mind that it's really only, all in all, maybe 2 weeks that he stays in what is actually Sami territory. Otherwise, he's with parsons, with bureaucrats at their home, at their stately homes, or in inns. There were, of course, also lots of inns. So that's definitely true. And the aspect of Linnaeus idealizing the Sami is also quite true. He is someone who shapes the image we have of the Sami as reindeer herders. And he does so, although he knows precisely, we know that from his journal, that there are still a lot of Sami who have a completely different livelihood. For example, fishermen. There's one point in the journal where Linnaeus says the Sami, or the Lapps as he calls it, like all fishermen, like to drink alcohol. And you stumble across this because you think, oops, Sami like all fishermen. So he's aware that most Sami are not reindeer herding. Some are even doing agriculture. But he presents this kind of pastoral life up in the mountains as a kind of parasitical state, and a very healthy lifestyle. So this is all quite true. I have been in touch with the museum. I assume this is the Linnaeus Museum in Uppsala. Yeah, I've been quite a lot. I've visited a lot and have also been in touch with, but for this, I haven't been in direct contact with them. What I presented to you were the results of a pilot project. Once it comes to the full project, so creating this new translation, this online edition, then we would seek to collaborate with precisely these kind of institutions. Yeah. Okay, and Garth, about the wobble fly. How on earth can the Sami regard the wobble fly as beneficial? Now, this is a tricky question. Of course, it is. The wobble fly is not beneficial as such. It does seem to be the case, though, that the wobble fly helps them. It is, of course, not, as Linnaeus claims, the wobble fly that herds the reindeer. But one particular problem that you have with the reindeer is once they get up into the mountains, they ideally should disperse into small groups and distribute over the fell, because there's not that much to eat, and they need to be a bit more scattered. And that kind of scattering, at least that's the belief of the Sami, is done by the presence of the wobble flies. So the big herds, and back then these were thousands of animals. The herds were much bigger than today because they were also milked. So you needed a lot of animals to actually produce a kind of surplus of cheese that you could then sell, or of meat. Meat was also sold a lot. And that is done by the wobble fly, in the belief of the Sami. It's probably, I mean, my guess would be that these kind of statements that those bloodthirsty animals, insects, help us, may also be a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I mean, it's probably also something you tell people that come as guests, complain about all these insects, to show that there's also a different way of looking at it. Yeah. So I wouldn't say it is. I wouldn't go as far without further investigation. I would say that this is a strongly held sort of scientific theory that the wobble fly indeed is beneficial, but it does reflect a worldview that is attentive to natural balance in nature, and the fact that there are always two sides to interactions in nature, yeah, it gives an interesting insight to indigenous thinking about nature. Are there more questions? I think we're also reaching the end of the session. So. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I can only thank you for the attention and for your patience, and hope that this gave a little bit of an insight into what is a very complex personality, Linnaeus.